He wasn't supposed to notice the flaw, because noticing it meant admitting that everything the system trusted was already too late. Inside a Sherman tank in France, surrounded by steel and procedure, a 24-year-old loader realized the problem wasn't enemy armor or firepower. It was that no one inside the tank could see the fight the way it was actually unfolding. Crews kept getting hit from angles they never anticipated, and every report blamed timing, luck, or positioning. But to Thompson, it looked like something simpler and far more dangerous. Everyone was reacting to a battlefield they were only partially seeing. That morning, with enemy tanks moving somewhere beyond their view, he understood one thing with unsettling clarity. If he was right, then the system meant to protect them was the very thing getting them killed. If this story pulls you in, hit like and subscribe, because what happens next isn't just intense. It challenges everything you think you know about how wars are actually won. Before the war, Thompson solved problems no one had time to explain, working long shifts in a steel mill outside Pittsburgh where mistakes weren't theoretical. They bent metal, broke machines, or injured people who stood too close. The work trained him in ways no manual ever described. He learned to read movement before it happened, to notice where force traveled through a structure, to understand how a small misalignment in one part could throw off everything connected to it. Nothing in that environment stayed abstract for long. If something didn't work, you didn't debate it. You adjusted it, fast, because the system itself wouldn't protect you from its own flaws. That mindset stayed with him long after he traded factory noise for the confined space of a tank turret. Inside the Army, though, problems were supposed to have official explanations. Training simplified everything into repeatable steps: identify, aim, fire, reload. Each role clearly defined, each action timed and practiced until it became automatic. Thompson followed those steps like everyone else. But what stood out to him wasn't how the process worked when everything went right. It was what happened when it didn't. The system assumed visibility, assumed coordination, assumed that information flowed cleanly between crew members. In reality, each man inside the tank operated within his own narrow slice of awareness, and the structure that was supposed to unify them often lagged behind the speed of what was actually happening outside. That difference between how things were supposed to function and how they actually did was something Thompson had spent years dealing with in another life. In the mill, if one worker couldn't see what another saw, the machine didn't slow down to compensate. You either found a way to bridge that gap or accepted the consequences. But in the tank, no one talked about that gap. It was built into the design, built into the roles, and reinforced by the assumption that the system itself was already optimized. Questioning it wasn't part of the job. What made Thompson different wasn't courage or rank. It was that he didn't separate thinking from doing. While others focused on executing their tasks exactly as trained, he kept noticing the small inefficiencies that didn't seem important until they lined up with something larger. The way the gunner had to shift position to check certain angles, the delay between a commander calling something out and the gunner reacting, the subtle pauses that never appeared in training scenarios, but showed up under pressure. None of these details were dramatic on their own, but together they formed a pattern he couldn't ignore. It wasn't that the system was failing completely. It was that it was just slightly behind reality. And in that environment, slight delays accumulated into irreversible outcomes. Thompson didn't think of it as a flaw at first, more like friction inside a machine that was supposed to run smoothly. In the mill, that kind of friction meant something needed to be adjusted, not accepted. But here, every adjustment required permission, and permission required proof, and proof usually came too late to matter. The tension built quietly, not through a single moment, but through repeated exposure to the same kind of situation. Thompson found himself watching not just what happened, but how it happened. How long it took for information to move, where attention shifted, how decisions formed under constraint. He wasn't trying to challenge the system. He was trying to understand why it produced the same outcomes over and over again. The more he paid attention, the more it felt less like a series of separate incidents and more like a predictable sequence. What unsettled him most was that the answer didn't seem complex. It wasn't about better weapons, or more training, or different tactics in the traditional sense. It was something more basic, something tied to how people perceived the environment they were operating in. In the steel mill, perspective determined safety as much as strength did. If you couldn't see the full motion of a machine, you were already reacting too late. That idea didn't come from theory. It came from experience, from watching how quickly things could go wrong when awareness lagged behind reality. The Army didn't train for that kind of thinking. It trained for coordination, for discipline, for following procedures that had been refined over time. Those procedures worked, most of the time, but they were built on assumptions that didn't always hold under pressure. Thompson didn't have the language to describe it in military terms, but he recognized the feeling. It was the same sensation he'd had in the mill when a machine started behaving just slightly off. Not enough to trigger alarms, but enough to signal that something underneath wasn't aligned the way it should be. That realization didn't immediately lead to action. It sat with him, unresolved, because acting on it meant stepping outside the boundaries of what he was supposed to do. Still, the longer he carried that awareness, the harder it became to ignore. What he had learned before the war wasn't something he could switch off. It shaped how he saw every movement, every delay, every moment where the system assumed more than it actually knew. And once he saw it that way, it stopped looking like isolated incidents and started looking like a problem, waiting for someone to decide whether to accept it or change it. The pattern didn't announce itself. It revealed itself through repetition, quiet enough that most men dismissed it as the cost of fighting an enemy who always seemed one step ahead, but consistent enough that Thompson could no longer treat each loss as separate. Every engagement followed a structure that no one had written down, yet everyone unconsciously accepted. A movement detected too late, a command issued under pressure, a response that lagged just enough to matter, and then the outcome was decided before anyone inside the tank fully understood what had happened. Reports framed it as misfortune or positioning, but Thompson recognized something else. Something closer to a mechanical sequence than a random event, and once he saw it that way, he couldn't unsee it. What made it more unsettling was how easily the pattern blended into normal operations. Crews adjusted their expectations without realizing it, learning to anticipate loss in ways that felt practical rather than alarming. Conversations after engagements rarely questioned the structure itself. They focused on what could be improved within it. Faster reactions, better coordination, more aggressive positioning. No one asked whether the structure they were trying to optimize was already flawed at its foundation. That kind of question didn't fit into how the system defined competence. Thompson began tracking details the way he once had on the factory floor, not formally, not with notes or measurements, but through observation layered over time. He noticed how often threats emerged from directions that required repositioning before response, how frequently the delay between awareness and action stretched just long enough to remove any advantage, how the sequence repeated regardless of terrain or experience. It wasn't that the men were unprepared, it was that they were working within limits they had been trained to accept as fixed. In another environment, those limits would have been challenged immediately. Here, they were treated as part of the reality of war. Late one afternoon, while maintenance crews moved between vehicles and the air, carried the steady hum of engines being checked and rechecked. Thompson found himself standing beside a mechanic named Eddie Collins, a man who had spent as much time around machines as Thompson had before the war, though in a different capacity. Collins had a reputation for understanding how things worked beneath the surface, the kind of person others went to when something didn't behave the way it should. Thompson mentioned what he had been noticing, not as a conclusion, but as a question. Why did the same kind of situation keep producing the same result, even when crews knew what to expect? Collins didn't dismiss the observation, but he didn't follow it either. He listened, nodded slightly, then leaned back against the side of the tank and said that combat wasn't like a factory, that variables couldn't be controlled the same way, that some things simply couldn't be fixed because they weren't broken in the way people wanted them to be. It wasn't indifference, it was acceptance. the kind that develops when experience teaches you where the boundaries are and how much it costs to push against them. Collins had seen enough to know that the system wasn't designed to be adjusted by individuals. And more importantly, that attempting to adjust it carried consequences that extended beyond the problem itself. That response stayed with Thompson, not because it resolved anything, but because it clarified the difference between seeing a problem and acting on it. Collins understood the mechanics. He could recognize inefficiencies, but he operated within the assumption that those inefficiencies were part of a larger structure that individuals weren't meant to change. Thompson couldn't reconcile that idea with what he had learned before the war. In his experience, systems didn't improve on their own. They were adjusted by the people who interacted with them, often in small, unrecognized ways that prevented larger failures later. Waiting for permission to correct something that was already producing consistent outcomes didn't make sense to him, especially when those outcomes weren't abstract. The more he considered it, the more the pattern felt less like an unavoidable condition and more like a chain of decisions that no one realized they were making. Each delay, each assumption, each reliance on a process that didn't fully match reality contributed to the same endpoint. No single step seemed significant enough to question, but together they formed a sequence that led to predictable results. Changing that sequence wouldn't require rewriting the entire system. It would require altering one part of it, just enough to disrupt the chain. That idea carried its own kind of tension, because identifying where to intervene meant stepping into territory that wasn't clearly defined by rank or role. Thompson wasn't trained to redesign anything. He wasn't responsible for how the tank functioned beyond his assigned duties. And yet the problem he saw existed precisely in the space between those duties. It wasn't a failure of any one position. It was a gap created by how those positions connected, or failed to connect, under pressure. Around him, nothing indicated that anything was wrong in a way that required immediate attention. Orders were followed, routines maintained, equipment checked and rechecked. From the outside, the system functioned exactly as intended. That was what made the pattern so difficult to confront. It didn't break the system, it operated within it, quietly producing outcomes that could always be explained after the fact. To challenge it meant questioning something that appeared to be working, at least by the standards it was measured against. Collins returned to his work, tightening fittings, checking lines, ensuring everything met the requirements expected of him, and in that sense, he represented the system at its most reliable. He kept things running, prevented obvious failures, maintained order where it could be maintained. Thompson respected that, understood the importance of it, but also saw the limitation. Keeping a system running wasn't the same as questioning whether it was running in the right way. Both were necessary, but only one was encouraged. That difference drew a line that Thompson couldn't ignore. On one side was acceptance, the understanding that certain outcomes were inevitable within the structure as it existed. On the other was the possibility that those outcomes were only inevitable because no one had chosen to alter the conditions that produced them. The gap between those two positions wasn't wide in theory, but in practice. It was defined by risk, by the consequences of acting without authorization, by the weight of stepping outside a role that had been clearly assigned. What made the situation more complex was that the system itself didn't resist change openly, it simply didn't account for it. There was no process for identifying this kind of problem, no channel for proposing a solution that didn't already fit within established categories. If Thompson wanted to address what he was seeing, he couldn't rely on the system to guide him, because the system didn't recognize the problem in the first place. That meant any decision to act would exist outside the structure that was supposed to manage decisions, and that reality carried implications that extended beyond a single moment. The pattern continued, whether acknowledged or not, shaping outcomes in ways that felt increasingly less like chance and more like consequence. And Thompson found himself standing at a point where understanding alone no longer felt sufficient. Seeing the sequence clearly created a different kind of responsibility, one that wasn't assigned, but emerged from the recognition itself. Ignoring it would mean accepting that the system's limitations were fixed, that the outcomes it produced were the best that could be expected. Acting on it would mean challenging that assumption without any guarantee that the result would justify the risk. The idea didn't arrive as a solution. It arrived as a contradiction that refused to settle into anything the system could explain. Thompson kept turning over the same question in his mind, not as a theory, but as something practical. Why did the gunner depend entirely on what was directly in front of him when the rest of the crew was already seeing more? The answer, according to training, was coordination. The commander observed. The gunner reacted. But that answer depended on time, and time was exactly where everything seemed to fall apart. The structure assumed that information could move fast enough to matter, yet every pattern Thompson had observed suggested otherwise. That gap wasn't dramatic. It was small, almost invisible, but it was consistent, and consistency meant it could be addressed. He didn't think in terms of redesigning the tank or improving the weapon. That kind of thinking belonged to engineers and officers, far removed from the inside of a turret during a live engagement. What he understood was more immediate. If one part of the crew had access to information that another part didn't, then the system was already incomplete. In the steel mill, that kind of imbalance would never be accepted as fixed. You didn't wait for a new machine. You adjusted how the existing one was used. Even if the adjustment wasn't officially recognized, the goal wasn't to follow the design perfectly. It was to make the system function under real conditions. That distinction mattered, because it reframed the problem from something abstract into something actionable. Thompson wasn't trying to outperform the enemy. He was trying to remove the delay that kept putting his crew behind. The more he examined it, the clearer it became that the issue wasn't speed in the physical sense. It was access. The gunner could only respond to what he could perceive, and his perception was limited by design. Expanding that perception didn't require changing the weapon. It required changing what the gunner could see without disrupting everything else he needed to do. Once that thought settled into something concrete, the next step followed with a kind of inevitability that made it harder to ignore. The solution didn't need to be complex, and in fact, complexity would have made it less useful under pressure. It needed to be immediate, intuitive, something that fit into the existing rhythm of the crew without adding another layer of coordination. Thompson had spent enough time around machinery to know that the best adjustments were often the ones that seemed almost too simple to matter, the kind that didn't require explanation once they were in place. But simplicity didn't make the decision easier. The system didn't evaluate ideas based on effectiveness alone. It evaluated them based on authorization. There were procedures for modifying equipment, channels for requesting changes, and none of those channels moved at the pace required for something that needed to work the next time the crew engaged. Acting outside those channels wasn't just discouraged. It was treated as a violation, something that undermined the structure that kept everything else functioning. Thompson understood that clearly. What he was considering wasn't just an adjustment. It was a choice to operate outside the system that defined his role. That realization introduced a different kind of pressure, one that had nothing to do with the enemy. In combat, risks were expected, even accepted, but they were tied to actions within the framework of orders and training. This was different. There was no instruction covering what he was about to do, no precedent he could point to if it went wrong. If the modification interfered with the gunner's ability to operate, if it created confusion instead of clarity, the consequences wouldn't be theoretical. They would happen in real time, without the option to undo the decision. He weighed that against what he already knew, not in abstract terms, but through the accumulation of observations that had led him here. The pattern wasn't a possibility. It was a repeated outcome. Doing nothing meant allowing that outcome to continue, trusting that the system would eventually compensate for something it hadn't recognized as a problem. Acting meant introducing a variable the system hadn't approved, one that might correct the delay or might create a different kind of failure. Neither option offered certainty, but only one had the potential to change the sequence he had been watching unfold. The actual act of implementing the idea didn't feel dramatic, it felt precise. the way adjustments always had in the mill. He focused on placement, on angles, on how the addition would integrate with the gunner's existing field of view without forcing him to shift position or break concentration. It wasn't about adding something new as much as it was about extending what was already there, creating a way for information to exist where it hadn't before. Every detail mattered, not because it needed to be perfect, but because it needed to work under conditions where there would be no time to correct it. What made the moment heavier was not the action itself, but the awareness of what it represented. This wasn't a solution that had been tested, approved, or even acknowledged. It existed entirely because one person had decided that the system's assumptions didn't match reality, and that decision carried forward into every possible outcome that followed. If it worked, no one would question how it had been allowed. If it failed, the responsibility would be immediate and unavoidable. The system offered no guidance here, no indication of whether the choice aligned with its priorities or violated them beyond repair. That absence of direction made the decision more personal than anything Thompson had faced since entering the war. It reduced everything to a single point: whether he trusted what he had observed enough to act on it without permission. The answer, once he reached it, didn't come with reassurance. It came with acceptance, the kind that acknowledged both the risk and the necessity of moving forward anyway. The first real test didn't arrive as a controlled situation. It unfolded under the same pressure that had defined every previous engagement. Except this time, Thompson wasn't watching the sequence from the outside. He was inside it, waiting to see whether a single change could interrupt something that had always felt inevitable. The tank moved forward with the rest of the column, metal grinding against uneven ground. The interior filled with the familiar rhythm of preparation, each crew member settling into a role that had been repeated often enough to feel automatic. Nothing in the system acknowledged that anything had changed, and that was exactly what made the moment so uncertain. The adjustment existed, but only one person fully understood what it meant. From the outside, the battlefield didn't offer clarity, only fragments, movement at a distance, terrain that concealed as much as it revealed, and the constant expectation that threats would emerge from somewhere just beyond immediate awareness. Inside the turret, those fragments translated into decisions that had to be made quickly, often before the full picture was visible. Thompson followed the sequence as he always had: loading, preparing, maintaining the rhythm that kept the system functioning, but his attention extended beyond the task itself. He wasn't just participating. He was measuring whether the change he had introduced would alter the way information moved inside that confined space. The first moments of contact followed the expected structure. A report came through, partial, uncertain, requiring interpretation. The commander responded, directing attention. The gunner adjusted, searching within the limits of what he could see. Up to that point, nothing had shifted, and for a brief instant, it felt as though the pattern would continue exactly as before. Thompson felt the familiar tension build, not from the presence of the enemy, but from the anticipation of the delay he had come to recognize. That small gap between awareness and action, where outcomes were usually decided. Then something changed, not dramatically, not in a way that would have been obvious to anyone outside the tank, but enough to interrupt the sequence. The gunner reacted before the commander completed the full chain of instruction, his movement guided by information that hadn't been available in previous engagements. It wasn't faster in the sense of speed alone, it was earlier. And that difference shifted everything that followed. The turret adjusted, the alignment happened sooner, and for the first time, the response wasn't trailing behind the situation, it was meeting it. Thompson recognized the shift immediately, not because of what happened externally, but because of how the internal rhythm changed. The delay he had come to expect didn't materialize in the same way. The sequence had been altered at a single point, and that alteration propagated through the rest of the process. What followed wasn't a clean or controlled outcome. It was still chaotic, still dependent on multiple factors. But the critical difference was that the system was no longer operating one step behind. In that moment, the adjustment proved something more significant than effectiveness. It demonstrated that the pattern wasn't fixed. What had been treated as an unavoidable structure was, in fact, dependent on conditions that could be changed. The realization didn't come as a sense of victory. It came as confirmation, a validation of something Thompson had only been able to infer before. The system hadn't been failing because it lacked strength or discipline. It had been limited by how information moved within it, and once that movement changed, the outcomes began to shift with it. The rest of the engagement unfolded with a different kind of awareness. Thompson continued his role, maintaining the sequence that allowed everything else to function, but now each action existed within a modified framework. The change didn't eliminate uncertainty. It didn't remove risk, but it disrupted the predictability of the outcomes he had been observing. The system was still the same in structure, yet it behaved differently because one element within it had been adjusted without altering anything else. What made the moment more complex was that the system itself didn't recognize what had happened. From an external perspective, the engagement could be explained through familiar terms: positioning, timing, coordination, without acknowledging the underlying shift. The cause and effect remained invisible to anyone not directly aware of the change. That invisibility carried its own implications, because it meant that the decision Thompson had made would not automatically be understood, even if it proved effective. As the engagement concluded and the immediate tension eased, the significance of what had occurred began to settle into something more concrete. The adjustment had not only worked, it had done so in a way that aligned seamlessly with the existing structure, altering outcomes without requiring the system to acknowledge the change. That created a new kind of question, one that extended beyond the moment itself. If a single decision could modify the sequence so effectively, what would happen if that decision were repeated, shared, or adopted by others operating within the same constraints? The answer wasn't immediate, but the direction was clear. What had been a personal observation had now become a functional change, and functional changes had a way of extending beyond their original context, especially when they addressed a limitation that others had experienced but not identified. The system might not recognize the problem, but the people within it would recognize the difference once they encountered it, and that recognition had the potential to spread in ways that no formal process could replicate. What spread next did not look like a formal change. It moved quietly through conversations, through observation, through the kind of practical trust that develops when something works under conditions where most things fail. Thompson didn't announce what he had done, and the system didn't record it, but the difference it created was visible to the people who experienced it directly. Crews noticed when reactions aligned more closely with unfolding situations, when movements inside the tank felt less delayed, when outcomes didn't follow the same predictable sequence they had come to expect. No report needed to explain it for others to become interested. The first to approach him were not officers, but other crew members, people who operated within the same constraints and understood the limitations without needing them defined. They didn't ask for a theory, they asked for a method. The Thompson showed them, not as an innovation, but as an adjustment, something that could be applied using what was already available. The simplicity of it made it easier to accept, because it didn't challenge the system directly, it worked around it. That distinction mattered, because it allowed the idea to spread without immediately triggering resistance. Eddie Collins encountered it again not as a conversation, but as a result. He noticed a tank returning from an engagement with fewer signs of strain than expected, the crew moving with a different kind of confidence that didn't match the usual pattern. When he examined the interior, he saw the change, subtle but deliberate, positioned in a way that suggested it had been designed for function rather than appearance. He understood immediately what it did, and, more importantly, what it implied. The limitation he had accepted as fixed had been addressed, not through official channels, but through a decision made outside them. That realization forced a shift in his own thinking. Collins had always operated within the boundaries of what was permitted, not out of fear, but out of an understanding of how systems maintain stability. Yet here was an example of a modification that improved outcomes without destabilizing anything else. It didn't disrupt the structure, it enhanced it, and it did so in a way that the system itself had failed to anticipate. The question he faced was no longer whether the problem existed, but whether continuing to accept it made sense when a solution had already proven itself in practice. He chose to act, not by challenging authority directly, but by applying the same adjustment in other tanks during routine maintenance, integrating it into the process in a way that appeared almost incidental. That decision marked a transition, not just for him, but for the idea itself. What had begun as a single, unauthorized action started to replicate, moving from one vehicle to another, from one crew to the next. Each application reinforced the previous one, creating a chain of changes that expanded without requiring formal approval. As more crews experienced the difference, the spread accelerated. The idea no longer depended on Thompson's direct involvement. It carried itself through shared experience. People didn't need to be convinced. They needed to see that it worked, and once they did, the decision to adopt it became less about permission and more about practicality. The system had not endorsed the change, but it also hadn't prevented it, and in that space the adjustment continued to propagate. When officers began to notice, their perspective differed from that of the crews. They didn't see the individual decisions, they saw the aggregated effect. Engagements unfolded differently, responses aligned more closely with unfolding conditions, and outcomes shifted in ways that couldn't be easily explained through existing doctrine. Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams encountered the change not as a proposal, but as a pattern. Multiple tanks exhibited the same modification, implemented independently yet consistently, suggesting that something was happening beneath the level of formal command. Abrams approached it not as a violation, but as a question. He examined the adjustment, considered its function, and compared it to the results he had been observing. What stood out was not the modification itself, but the fact that it addressed a limitation the system had not formally acknowledged. It provided access to information that had previously been delayed, and that access translated into decisions made under different conditions than before. From his position, the significance wasn't tied to how the idea originated, but to what it changed. That perspective allowed him to do something the system rarely did: recognize the value of an unauthorized solution without requiring it to fit into an existing framework first. Instead of suppressing it, he permitted it to continue, effectively transforming a series of individual decisions into an accepted practice. That shift didn't come with immediate documentation or formal approval, but it altered how the system responded to the change. What had existed outside the structure began to move toward incorporation, not because it followed procedure, but because its effects were too consistent to ignore. As the adjustment spread beyond a single unit, its impact extended in ways that reflected the nature of the original decision. Each instance was small, localized, applied by individuals who recognized its value, yet collectively, those instances formed a larger shift in how tanks operated under real conditions. The system adapted not by redesigning itself from the top down, but by absorbing changes that had emerged from the bottom up. That process lacked the clarity of formal implementation, but it carried a different kind of efficiency, one driven by necessity rather than planning. At higher levels of command, figures like General George Patton evaluated the results in broader terms, focusing on performance, on how units engaged, and what those engagements produced. The underlying cause remained less visible, but the effect was measurable. When a pattern of improvement aligns with operational success, it demands attention, regardless of how it originated. ORIS began to reflect that reality, not by detailing the reasoning behind the change, but by ensuring its continuation across a wider range of units. What made this sequence significant was not just the spread of a single adjustment, but the way it revealed how systems evolve under pressure. The original decision had not been part of a coordinated effort. It had been a response to a specific limitation observed by one person. Yet because that limitation existed across multiple units, the solution found relevance far beyond its initial context. Each new application reinforced the previous ones, creating a cascade that moved through the system without following its usual pathways. The tension that defined the earlier decision didn't disappear, it transformed. Instead of existing at the level of one individual choosing whether to act, it shifted to the system itself, which now had to reconcile the presence of a solution it had not authorized but could not dismiss. Accepting it meant acknowledging that effective changes could originate outside established processes. Ignoring it meant disregarding improvements that directly affected outcomes. In that space, the system adjusted, not by rewriting its rules immediately, but by allowing the results to redefine what those rules needed to accommodate. Years later, no official record could point to a single moment when anything truly changed, because from the system's perspective, nothing had happened in a way that fit its definitions. There was no directive that captured the first decision, no report that traced how it moved from one crew to another, no document that explained why outcomes began to shift in ways that earlier assumptions couldn't account for. What existed instead were results. Patterns of survival that looked different from what had come before, without a clear origin attached to them. Thompson returned to a life that resembled the one he had left, working again with metal, solving practical problems that rarely drew attention beyond the immediate need to fix them. The skills that had once shaped a decision inside a tank didn't disappear, but they also didn't become part of any formal recognition. To the system, he remained what he had always been, a crewman who had performed his role. The adjustment he had made did not translate into rank or reward, because it had never passed through the channels that defined official contributions. For others, the effects lingered in ways that were harder to quantify but impossible to ignore. Crews who had operated with the adjustment carried forward an understanding that something fundamental had shifted, even if they couldn't fully articulate it within the language of doctrine. The difference wasn't tied to a specific tool or technique, as much as it was tied to a change in how they perceived their environment, access to information, timing of decisions, the relationship between observation and action. All of it had been altered by something that had started as a single, unauthorized choice. Eddie Collins carried that realization in a different way. He had spent years maintaining systems, ensuring that everything functioned according to expectation. Yet he had seen firsthand how one decision made outside those expectations could reshape outcomes across multiple units. It forced him to reconsider what it meant to keep a system running. Stability, he understood now, did not come only from preserving structure. It also came from recognizing when that structure needed to adapt. Even if the adaptation originated from a place the system didn't control. Looking back, the sequence of events did not appear dramatic in isolation. There was no single moment that stood apart as decisive, no clear point where the system acknowledged a shift and adjusted accordingly. Instead, the change unfolded through accumulation, through repeated applications of the same idea, through decisions made by individuals who recognized a practical improvement and chose to apply it. Each decision was small, almost insignificant on its own, yet together they formed a pattern that altered outcomes across a much larger scale. That is where the full weight of the situation becomes clear. If the original decision had not been made, if Thompson had chosen to accept the system's limitations rather than act on what he observed, the pattern he identified would have continued uninterrupted. The outcomes it produced would have remained consistent, explained in the same terms, accepted in the same way. The difference between those two paths did not lie in a major strategic shift or a new piece of equipment. It lay in a single moment where someone chose to trust a skill developed outside the system over the assumptions reinforced within it. What makes that realization difficult is that it does not fit easily into the way success is usually understood. There is no clear line connecting the decision to each individual outcome it influenced. No simple way to measure how many lives were affected by a change that spread without formal acknowledgement. The system eventually incorporated the adjustment, refined it, standardized it. But by the time it did, the origin of the idea had already been absorbed into something larger, something that no longer pointed back to the moment it began. This raises a question that extends beyond this particular story, one that applies to any system built to manage complex situations. How many solutions exist outside the boundaries of what is recognized? waiting for someone to notice not just that a problem exists, but that the way it is being understood may be incomplete. And how often are those solutions overlooked? Not because they lack effectiveness, but because they do not originate from within the structure designed to approve them. The answer is not simple, and it does not offer a clear conclusion. Systems are necessary. They provide order, coordination, and consistency, but they are also limited by the assumptions they are built on. When those assumptions no longer match reality, the gap between what is expected and what actually happens begins to widen, often in ways that are difficult to detect until the consequences become unavoidable. In those moments, the ability to recognize and act on something outside the established framework becomes critical, even if it carries risk. The story does not resolve by declaring one approach right and the other wrong. It leaves a tension that remains relevant, the balance between following a system that has been designed to function and recognizing when that system needs to be adjusted by the people within it. Thompson's decision did not dismantle the system. It revealed a limitation and addressed it in a way that the system eventually absorbed, but only after it had already proven necessary. What remains is not a definitive conclusion, but a perspective. The skills developed in ordinary environments, the kind that rarely draw attention, can become decisive when systems encounter situations they were not designed to handle. And sometimes, the most significant changes do not begin with authority or recognition, but with a single decision made in a moment where waiting for permission would have meant accepting an outcome that no longer needed to be inevitable.